He was shoved to the ground, handcuffed like a criminal just for driving home while black. Malcolm Hayes said nothing, even when the white cops mocked him, even when the judge called him just another troublemaker. What no one knew was that Malcolm wasn't just another defendant, he was one of the highest-ranking federal prosecutors in the state. And when he finally spoke, the entire courtroom stopped breathing. Can one man's truth bring down a courtroom built on prejudice? If this shocks you, hit like, share the story, and subscribe. Let's uncover what really happened. It was close to 9:30 p.m. when Malcolm Hayes finally got into his car. The city was quiet, just a soft hum of tires on asphalt, and the lingering taste of red wine and roasted salmon from a dinner with colleagues. Nothing fancy, just laughter, politics, a toast to a long week at the U.S. Attorney's office. He loosened his tie, exhaled, and merged into traffic. 10 minutes from home. Then blue and red lights lit up behind him. Malcolm didn't jump, didn't panic. He just sighed, a long, tired breath. Here we go again, he muttered under his breath, easing the car toward the shoulder. This wasn't new. Not for a tall, well-dressed black man in a black BMW. Not even when you're the assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Georgia. He rolled down the window, both hands resting on the steering wheel. Standard protocol. The cruiser door slammed. Heavy boots approached. Then came the voice. Driver. Keep your hands where I can see 'em sharp. Barked. Without a greeting. Malcolm's eyes lifted to the rear view. 2 officers. One led the charge. Officer Cole Maddox, white, mid-40s, thick-necked buzz-cut, chewing something with a jaw that looked permanently clenched. Behind him, Officer Ron Becker, younger, quieter, sharp eyes scanning everything but saying nothing. Maddox didn't even glance at Malcolm's face. License and registration, no explanation, no courtesy. Malcolm stayed calm. Officer, may I ask why I'm being pulled over? Maddox huffed. Taillights cracked. Malcolm blinked. Sir, I drive this car every day. No damage. That's when Maddox leaned in, tone sharpening like a knife. You questioning me, boy? Malcolm's spine stiffened at that word. Boy. But his voice, still calm. No, sir. I'm asking for the legal reason behind this stop. Maddox didn't like that. You got 30 seconds to step out of the vehicle or I'll drag you out. Becker shifted his stance but said nothing. Malcolm looked straight ahead, thought about flashing his badge, saying the words, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Malcolm Hayes. I write the briefs that land people like you in federal court. But he didn't. Not yet. He wasn't interested in asserting power. He was interested in something deeper, the truth of how they'd treat a black man, who they thought had none. So he stayed seated. I'm not stepping out until I know why. That was enough. Maddox reached for the handle, yanked open the door, and in one violent motion grabbed Malcolm by the arm and wrenched him from the driver's seat. Malcolm's feet barely hit the ground before Maddox had him spun, arms twisted behind metal, snapping on wrists. Becker glanced around. A porch light flicked on across the street. Malcolm grunted but didn't resist. His voice low. You're making a mistake. Maddox pressed him against the hood. Oh yeah. You threatening me now? No, Malcolm said, eyes locked on the rearview mirror still hanging crooked from the yank. I'm stating a fact, Maddox scoffed, patting him down aggressively. Got any weapons, Mr. Know-It-All? I'm unarmed. Becker finally spoke, voice a shade softer. Cole, maybe we should check the taillight first. Maddox didn't answer. He was too busy tightening the cuffs. Becker circled the car, squinting at the lights, his eyebrows furrowed. No cracks, no flicker, fully intact. Becker's mouth opened like he might say something, then closed again. Across the street, behind a curtain, a man held up his phone. Recording, quietly, fingers trembling just a little. Back at the hood, Malcolm stood tall despite the cuffs, dignity radiating in silence. Maddox circled to face him, smirking. You got something to say now? Malcolm met his eyes. No, not yet. Maddox shook his head and muttered, "Another one who thinks he's somebody." But Malcolm didn't answer. He'd learned long ago. When they see your skin first, they don't hear anything else. His silence wasn't fear. It was strategy. And this wasn't over, not by a long shot. They kept him in a holding cell for 4 hours. 4 hours. No phone call, no attorney, no name check. Just silence, fluorescent lights, and the sound of boots echoing on concrete floors. Malcolm sat on a hard bench, cuffs finally off wrists, bruised, suit, wrinkled tie, gone. The room smelled of bleach and rust. His back was straight, his face unreadable, but inside he was boiling. "Still think you're too good to answer?" Officer Cole Maddox stood on the other side of the bars, arms crossed, sneering. "See in here. Out there makes no damn difference. The law is me." He leaned in just enough for Malcolm to catch the breath of stale coffee and entitlement. You're just another shadow in the system. Don't matter what you wear. You know that, don't you?" Malcolm said nothing. He could have stood up, shouted, demanded his call. He could have flashed his federal badge hours ago and shut this whole circus down. But he didn't, because he wanted to see how far they'd go, how deep the rot ran. In the corner of the booking room, Officer Becker sat at a desk, typing up the intake form. Malcolm could see the screen through the glass. Name Malcolm Hayes. Wrong spelling. Address 211 W. Armstrong Ave., a made-up street. Occupation unemployed. Becker didn't ask. He just filled in whatever suited the narrative. Sloppy. Intentional. Malcolm stared at him. Becker looked up once. Their eyes met. Becker hesitated, then looked away. Guilty men often do. One of the desk sergeants walked by and dropped a bag onto the table, Malcolm's belongings. His phone, wallet, a slim leather case. Inside that case, a gold badge, U.S. Department of Justice, Assistant United States Attorney. Still untouched, still unshown. He didn't need to wave it like a weapon. He wanted them to choose how they treated him when they thought he had no power. And they had chosen. In the silence, a memory surfaced. A dorm room, fall semester, junior year. Darius Moore. Tall, brilliant, blacker than night and twice as loud. They were roommates at Georgetown, studied constitutional law together, argued about everything, court rulings, jazz girls, the best barbecue in D.C. Then one night Darius didn't come back. Wrong place, wrong time. They said he matched the description. They said he ran. They said he couldn't breathe. Darius never made it to law school. Malcolm did. And ever since he'd promised himself he'd fight from the inside out. Tonight was just a new battlefield. Back at the front desk, someone whispered, "Hey, check this out." Becker's head turned. A young rookie with his phone out waved him over. On the screen, a blurry video shot from a front porch. It showed a black man in a dark suit being yanked from a car, thrown against the hood, cuffed without resistance. No violence, no threat, just humiliation. The clip was posted on a small local forum called Southside Truths. Caption another one pulled over for nothing. Driving while black comments were growing. Typical. Again, somebody needs to ID that guy. Becker's face paled. He glanced at Malcolm, then back at the video. An hour later, someone finally came in. "Release him," the watch commander said. "No charges filed." Maddox snapped. "What the hell you mean no charges?" "Captain's orders," the commander grunted. "Let him go." Maddox threw his hands up. "Fine, but I'm writing it up. Obstruction." He was disrespectful. Becker didn't say a word. He just hit delete on the intake form. All gone. Malcolm stood as they handed him back his jacket. He slid it on slowly, smoothed the lapels, adjusted the collar. then reached into the inside pocket, pulled out the badge, and held it up. "I suggest you look up my name again before you delete the file, Officer Becker." Maddox froze. Becker's jaw dropped. Malcolm didn't shout, didn't curse, just met their eyes one by one. Cold, calm, controlled. "I'm not pressing charges. Yet. But I remember everything." Then he turned and walked out. When Malcolm received the formal charges, he didn't flinch, but his fingers paused on the paper just long enough to register the weight of each word. Resisting arrest, disturbing the peace, obstructing a police officer, 3 crimes, all false, all punishable, all designed to make him the aggressor. The courtroom was cold, not just in temperature but in tone. Dark wood panels, faded flags, and a silence that didn't feel respectful. It felt rehearsed. Judge Caroline Whitmore sat high above, draped in her black robe like it was armor. 60 years old, stone-faced, known across the state as the Ice Gavel. She didn't make eye contact with Malcolm as he stood before her. Didn't smile. Didn't even nod. "Mr. Hayes," she said flatly, "do you understand the charges brought against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, calm but firm. She didn't ask if he had anything to say. She didn't have to. She had already made up her mind. The prosecution team, led by Assistant DA Daniel Greaves, came in like a wave of confidence. Greaves was young, white, and polished, barely pushing 40 but already notorious for turning petty charges into career-boosting convictions. His opening statements weren't just arguments. They were performances. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began walking slowly, voice low. "This case is not about race. It's not about status. It's about a man who refused to obey the law." He paused for effect. A man who thought he was above it. And just like that, the tone was set. Malcolm's defense attorney was Luis Mendez, a well-meaning public defender in his early 30s, fresh out of his depth. He adjusted his tie more than he spoke. His voice trembled at the edges, but to his credit, he tried. "Your Honor, Luis said we request the body cam footage from the arrest to demonstrate my client's behavior." "No such footage," Judge Whitmore interrupted sharply. Luis blinked. "Excuse me." The camera was reported malfunctioning by both officers. Request denied. Luis turned to Malcolm briefly. Malcolm didn't move. Greaves leaned back in his chair, smug. The next 2 hours felt like theater. The officers were called to the stand. Maddox spoke with controlled bravado. He was aggressive from the start, refused to cooperate. Reached into his jacket, could have been a weapon. "Did you fear for your safety?" Greaves asked. "Absolutely." Becker followed. Quieter, calculated. He raised his voice. "I tried to de-escalate. Not once did they mention the badge. Not once did they mention the real story." Luis tried to object, but every time he rose, overruled Judge Whitmore snapped. Again and again. The jury watched, nodding slightly, already pulled into the narrative. 12 faces, mostly white. One black woman, mid-50s, who hadn't made eye contact with Malcolm once. From the gallery, the tension was so thick it felt hard to breathe. And still, Malcolm said nothing. No outbursts, no protest, no angry monologue. Just silence. And somehow that silence unsettled the room more than anything else. During a brief recess, Luis leaned over. "Malcolm," he whispered, "I don't understand. They're railroading you. We need to speak up. Say something. Tell them who you are." Malcolm shook his head slowly. "Not yet." Luis frowned. Why Malcolm's voice was calm. "Because I want them to finish what they started." The bailiff called the court back into session. Judge Whitmore returned without a glance at the defense table. And the game resumed. The courtroom lights felt harsher that morning, like truth had no place left to hide. Greaves wasted no time. His voice filled the room with quiet authority as he paced in front of the jury box holding a stack of neatly printed pages. "This," he said, lifting a page, "is Officer Maddox's sworn statement, written within an hour of the incident. Let's go through it together." Maddox took the stand again, this time with a slight swagger in his posture. He was yelling, Maddox claimed. I told him to stay in the vehicle, but he threw the door open, started screaming that I had no right to stop him. Did he threaten you, Officer Maddox? Yes, Maddox said. He said, and I quote, "You don't know who you're messing with." His tone was aggressive. He jerked away when I reached for his ID. Malcolm sat still. No reaction. Just a slow, steady blink. And what happened next, Greaves prompted. He reached for his jacket. Quick, sudden. I thought he was going for a weapon. Then it was Becker's turn. If Maddox was fire, Becker was smoke quiet, calculated, easy to overlook. But his words were just as sharp. His body language was combative, Becker said flatly. Hands clenched, shoulders squared. He looked ready to swing. Louise stood. Objection. Subjective interpretation. Sustained, Whitmore said without looking up. But the damage was already done. The jury had heard it. Then came the evidence. Greaves turned to the screen beside the judge's bench. We have traffic cam footage of the arrest. Unfortunately, the dash cam malfunctioned, but this angle confirms the officer's version. The video rolled. Grainy, silent, and framed from across the intersection, barely enough to see clearly, but just enough to cast doubt. In the flickering black and white, it looked like Malcolm might have moved fast. He might have raised his voice. There was no sound, no context. But suspicion is a powerful thing. And Greaves knew exactly what he was doing. Notice the aggressive posture, he said, pointing. Note how the defendant jerks away. That's not what happened. Luis muttered almost to himself. Luis stood and tried. He walked to the center of the room, voice unsteady. My client never raised his voice. He never threatened anyone. And we all know how misleading a silent, low-quality video can be. Then why didn't your client explain himself? Greaves interrupted smoothly. Why didn't he identify himself as a federal attorney? Luis turned helplessly to the judge. Because he was caged, he said. Because dignity doesn't beg to be recognized. Whitmore raised a brow. Stick to the facts, counselor. A ripple ran through the jury. The older man in the second row scratched his chin. A young woman at the edge narrowed her eyes, but the rest leaned back. Some were folding their arms. Some were already convinced. Back at the defense table, Malcolm looked up at the ceiling like it might offer him oxygen. Luis sat down slowly, defeated. He whispered, "They're buying it. All of it." Malcolm didn't respond. His hand gently brushed the inside pocket of his blazer where the badge sat untouched, waiting. Then Judge Whitmore cleared her throat. "Mr. Hayes, do you wish to make any statement before we proceed?" Her tone wasn't curious. It was dismissive, like she already knew he wouldn't. But this time he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just steady. His chair let out a low squeak as he pushed it back. And then from his pocket, he drew the badge. A small leather-folded case. The kind you've seen in movies, but this one was real. Crisp. Unmistakable. He opened it in silence, turned toward the jury, held it at chest level. The gold seal of the U.S. Department of Justice gleamed under the courtroom lights. Malcolm Hayes, he said calmly. Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. The room froze. Literally froze. Greaves dropped the pen in his hand. Whitmore's face tightened like someone had yanked her chair out from under her. And Luis looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He just stood there, badge in hand, truth radiating from his silence. I chose not to reveal my identity. He continued, because I wanted to see how far this system would go. When it thinks no one is watching, you could have heard a pin drop. But behind the silence, tension twisted into something new. Fear. Because the courtroom had just realized something very important. They picked the wrong man to frame. The air in the courtroom was no longer just tense. It was scorched, still. Malcolm stood in the center of the room, his voice even. but each word hit like a silent thunderclap. Malcolm Hayes, Assistant United States Attorney. Not a shout, not a boast, a fact. An undisputed, federally backed fact. The effect was instant. The jury stared like statues in pews, eyes wide, mouths slightly parted. A man in the second row muttered something under his breath. The woman beside him clutched her purse a little tighter. On the other side, Greaves blinked once, then twice, then again, as if his brain couldn't catch up with what his ears had just heard. He fumbled with the pen in his hand, dropped it, tried to pick it up and missed. "Your Honor." He started, but his voice cracked. He sat back down without finishing the sentence. Across the room, Maddox's jaw locked tight. For the first time since this all began, he didn't look smug, didn't look proud. He looked exposed. Becker beside him shifted his weight. His eyes darted between Malcolm and the judge. His hands, once confidently folded, now rubbed against each other like he was washing away something invisible. And poor Mendez. He nearly stumbled out of his chair. He looked up at Malcolm like he'd just seen a ghost, or a lion he thought was a lamb. "You're," he whispered, voice dry. "Why didn't you say something from the start?" Malcolm looked at him with the same calm he'd carried all along, the kind of calm that comes from years of being underestimated and still choosing restraint over rage. Then, with every eye watching him, Malcolm turned back toward the bench. "I didn't say anything," he said clearly, because if I weren't a federal prosecutor, I would still deserve to be treated lawfully. Silence. Total silence. Even Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly, just a flicker, but for someone like her, it was as loud as a scream. Malcolm didn't blink. Being someone important shouldn't be the requirement to be treated with basic dignity, he continued. That badge doesn't make me human. I walked in here as a man, and I was caged like an animal because of how I looked, not because of what I did. A murmur rolled through the room, not loud, but rising. From the back bench, a faint rustling sound could be heard, someone adjusting their phone. Zoe Franklin, a young black journalist with sharp eyes and a sharper instinct, had been recording quietly ever since Malcolm pulled the badge. Now her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. She whispered to herself, this is the story. The moment felt heavy, like history was in the room leaning forward. Judge Whitmore for once looked unsure. Her hand hovered over the gavel, but she didn't bring it down. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice clipped. "Why did you not inform the court of your position earlier?" Malcolm met her gaze head on. "Would it have changed how Officer Maddox threw me to the ground?" he asked. "Would it have changed how your court denied the body cam evidence, or how Mr. Greaves painted me as a threat?" He let it sit for a beat. Because if revealing a title is the only way to earn justice, then there's something wrong with this system. There it was. Not anger, not revenge, just truth. And it cut through the courtroom cleaner than any gavel strike ever could. A few jurors shifted in their seats. One of them, a middle-aged black woman, wiped the corner of her eye with her sleeve. Then Zoe stood up. Her voice was firm, respectful, but full of something the room hadn't yet heard: hope. "Your Honor, this moment is public record, correct?" Judge Whitmore stiffened. "Only transcripts are official. I've recorded everything since the defense stood up." She held up her phone. "This story is already online." Gasps. Real ones. A murmur ran through the pews. Zoe's post was already racking up views. Wrongfully arrested. U.S. Attorney reveals identity in court. It was spreading like wildfire. Greaves rose quickly. "We request a recess. Immediate review. This changes everything." Maddox stood too face pale. "This is out of context. He's manipulating public perception." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't need to. For once, the court wasn't on their side. Outside the building, on the courthouse steps, people had begun to gather. Word had reached the sidewalks. Reporters, activists, concerned citizens. A storm was forming, and for the first time in this whole process, Malcolm wasn't alone. The courtroom hadn't made a sound for almost a minute. Even the ticking wall clock seemed hesitant now. Judge Caroline Whitmore shifted in her chair, eyes fixed on the man who had just shattered every assumption in the room. Malcolm Hayes, Assistant U.S. Attorney. Greaves stood frozen, his jaw clenched, fingers tightening around his legal pad. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a short recess." "No." Whitmore interrupted, her voice cool but firmer than before. "We proceed." Malcolm sat back down without a word. The silence he had held for days had just detonated like a quiet bomb, every fragment now scattering across the courtroom's marble floor. Greaves hesitated, then awkwardly shuffled his notes. But the damage was done. His case wasn't just leaking, it was bleeding. Malcolm leaned toward his public defender. "Luis," he said calmly, "ask for the radio log from the night of my arrest." Luis Mendez blinked. Radio log. Every police car logs their calls. Maddox's lies won't hold against the record. For a moment, Luis hesitated, then stood this time without trembling. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests the radio communication log from Patrol Unit 47B on the night in question." Greaves protested, but Whitmore didn't immediately respond. She just looked at Malcolm. Not with hostility, not even confusion, but something else. A pause, perhaps, of old conscience stirring beneath years of courtroom routine. Her eyes flicked toward the court clerk. Granted. Across the room, Officer Maddox finally broke his gaze with the judge. He looked down. Becker shifted beside him, eyes darting, palms flat against his thighs, damp with sweat. The energy had shifted. You could feel it. The jury, once stiff skeptical, was leaning forward now, literally. The man they'd silently judged was no longer the man on trial. He was the man challenging the entire process. Mendez adjusted his tie and stepped forward. He didn't look back at Malcolm. He didn't need to. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice steadier than it had been all week. "I came into this courtroom unprepared, not for the law, but for the weight of what this case really means. We've heard accusations, seen vague footage, and been told to assume guilt. But now we have a name, a badge, a man who trusted the system so much. He let it test him to its bitter core." He pointed at Maddox and Becker. "And we're going to show you step by step how every word they spoke was a fabrication. Because the truth was never just about who yelled or who stood still. It's about whether justice still recognizes the difference between power and abuse." The room didn't applaud. It didn't have to. The silence after Mendez's final sentence was louder than anything. Judge Whitmore leaned back. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't ruling. She was remembering. Her first day on the bench decades ago. The fire she once carried for fairness, for truth. Somewhere along the way, that fire had been buried beneath years of convenience and politics. And now, here it was again, rekindled by the man they nearly condemned. Malcolm met her eyes. Just for a moment. No challenge, no anger, only quiet expectation. Outside, the sky had darkened, but inside that courtroom, something was beginning to crack, not loudly but deeply, like marble under pressure. For the first time, justice didn't feel like a performance. It felt possible. Zoe Franklin didn't even wait to get home. She sat in her car outside the courthouse, the engine off her hands, shaking only slightly as she tapped the post button. The video went live with a caption written in all caps, U.S. "Prosecutor arrested by racist cops. Watch this." Within minutes, the clip had over 3,000 views, then 15,000, then 50,000. By the time Zoe pulled into her driveway 20 minutes later, her phone was buzzing non-stop. Messages, mentions, calls, screenshots. Every notification felt like a spark catching fire. By hour 2, the hashtag #JusticeForMalcolm was trending nationally. and by hour 6, it was the #1 topic on X. Cable news couldn't ignore it any longer. CNN was first. A split-screen broadcast on the left, Malcolm's calm declaration in the courtroom. On the right, Maddox dragging him from the car. The contrast was impossible to unsee. MSNBC followed with a panel titled Racial Profiling or Judicial Failure, the Hayes Arrest Debate. Even Fox News was forced to respond, though they chose to focus on Malcolm's silence during the arrest, trying to frame it as suspicious. But the clip didn't lie, and the people weren't buying spin anymore. A Black Marine veteran reposted the video, adding, "We fought for justice overseas. Why can't we have it here?" By midnight, several civil rights organizations had released formal statements demanding a federal investigation, not just into the arrest, but into the courtroom itself. Judge Whitmore's record was now public conversation. An investigative thread with over 2 million views listed case after case: Black defendants, harsh sentencing, rejected evidence. Over 80% of objections sustained for the prosecution, less than 30% for defense. The pattern was hard to deny. People were no longer asking if Malcolm Hayes had been wronged. They were asking how many others had no badge to protect them. Outside the courthouse the next morning, protesters gathered holding handmade signs: "Being black is not probable cause. End qualified immunity. We believe Malcolm." News trucks lined the street. Malcolm, watching from inside a private conference room with Mendez and Zoe, simply said, "It's not about me anymore." Mendez looked up from his notepad. It never was. But now they're listening. Zoe, still in her blazer from the night before, checked her phone again. "You're getting calls from journalists, podcasts, even the New York Times. They all want a statement." Malcolm shook his head. "No interviews," he said. "Let the courtroom speak. I'm not the story justice is." Still, the noise was undeniable. A law student from Boston posted a clip of Malcolm's speech with the comment, "First time I've seen the law stand taller than the bench. Maybe we've got a shot." That comment alone had over 60,000 likes. And yet, amidst all the momentum, Malcolm knew better than to celebrate. The system didn't break overnight, and it wouldn't fix itself just because it got caught. The room grew quiet again. Zoe finally asked softly, "Do you think they'll back off?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the sea of people. Signs, chants, cameras, voices. Then he turned back and said, "No. They'll push harder. But now they know we're not silent. And silence is what they've always counted on." Outside, the crowd erupted into a chant that echoed off the stone steps and into the city beyond. "We want truth." Zoe Franklin sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, her fingers still trembling slightly from what she'd just captured. She didn't wait. The moment the session recessed, she stepped outside, leaned against the courthouse's cold granite pillar, and uploaded the clip to X. The caption read, "U.S. prosecutor arrested by racist cops while silent, he watched them dig their own graves," and the hashtag, #justice for Malcolm. It took 6 hours. 6 hours for that video to ignite something far bigger than Zoe had expected. By noon, the hashtag was trending at #1. People weren't just sharing the video, they were dissecting every second. The moment Malcolm pulled out his badge, the stunned expression on Judge Whitmore's face, the look of betrayal when Prosecutor Greaves realized who he'd tried to bury. It spread like fire in dry grass. On college campuses, students gathered in clusters between classes, huddled over phones, whispering, "Did you see that? Did he really just sit there through all of it?" Yeah. And that last line, "Even if I wasn't a prosecutor, I still deserved to be treated lawfully." Chills. Zoe's post was reposted by local reporters, then national journalists, then CNN, MSNBC. Even The Atlantic picked it up within 24 hours. Malcolm's name was now a headline. The prosecutor they tried to erase. Systemic bias and 4 minutes and 12 seconds of silence. In one heated panel on MSNBC, the host asked bluntly, if Malcolm Hayes hadn't flashed that badge, would we even be talking about this case today? The panelist, a former judge, shook his head. No, we'd be talking about the conviction of another unruly black man. That's the point. That's the tragedy. Back outside the courthouse, something was happening. People began to gather, not in anger at first, but in witness, in grief, in recognition. Candles were lit, signs were raised, voices chanted not in rage, but in unity. Say his name, Malcolm Hayes. Being black is not probable cause. We want truth. Someone projected the clip onto the side of the courthouse wall at night. It played on a loop. People brought lawn chairs. Someone played soft jazz through a speaker, not to distract, but to remind. An older black woman wrapped in a shawl whispered through tears, "My son died in custody. They said he resisted." But there was no footage, no clip, no Zoe. Then she looked toward the wall and added, "This time the truth made it out." Inside the court, Whitmore noticed the shift. The next day, the courthouse had extra security, but there was no violence, no threats, just eyes watching, just voices recording. Transparency had arrived uninvited. A week later, CNN aired a full segment tracing Judge Whitmore's case history. In the last 5 years, her conviction rate for black defendants was disproportionately higher than any of her peers. Her approval of body cam footage requests, below 11%. Her recorded interruptions of defense attorneys almost exclusively against public defenders. A reporter asked, "Was this just one mistake, or has this court been blind for too long?" The question echoed far beyond Georgia. In Iowa, a white law student wrote in a campus forum, "I've read about racial injustice for years, but this was the first time I saw what it looks like to be silenced with a smile. The law shouldn't need a badge to be respected. For the first time, it feels like justice has a chance to win." And still, through all of it, Malcolm Hayes remained quiet. No press conferences, no public statement, no interviews. His silence now had a different weight. Not the silence of restraint, but of purpose. People began writing signs that simply said, "Let Malcolm speak when he's ready." And until then, the crowd outside the courthouse grew. Some brought coffee and folding chairs. Others handed out copies of the Constitution. A few offered free legal advice to anyone with a record. It was no longer just about Malcolm. It was about all the voices that had never gotten the chance. Zoe stood quietly near the back of the crowd one afternoon, camera in hand, watching the reflection of her own footage glowing on the courthouse wall. "Why do you think it went so viral?" a young intern beside her asked. She thought about it for a moment, then said softly, "Not because it was dramatic, not because it was powerful, but because it never should have needed to be." And with that, she turned off her camera, placed it gently in her bag, and sat down on the cold courthouse steps, waiting like everyone else for the next chapter. It started with a leak. At first, people thought it was a hoax, a doctored screenshot maybe. But then more came. Full email threads, not just fragments, time-stamped, signed, internal. The most damning line came from Officer Maddox himself. "If he stays quiet, it'll be easier to spin. Frame it as aggression, we've done it before. No context could clean that up." By noon, the leak had made its way to every newsroom in the country. Civil rights attorneys pounced. Journalists dissected every word. Hashtag #system exposed climbed right behind #justice for Malcolm. By 3:00 p.m., the mayor's office called for an independent investigation. They stood at the podium, somber-faced, reading from a prepared statement, pledging transparency, accountability. But no one was buying it. Crowds outside the courthouse didn't thin, they thickened. Signs shifted from hope to fury. "Your badge isn't a shield." "How many emails are still hidden? Fire doesn't clean corruption. Truth does." That same evening, both Officer Maddox and Officer Becker were formally suspended without pay. Their names now under federal review. Whispers of criminal charges began circling. Obstruction, perjury, conspiracy. Their precinct issued a brief statement. "We are cooperating fully." But for many, that wasn't enough. Inside the courthouse, the mood had shifted. Whitmore sat noticeably quieter on the bench, less interruption, more silence, as if the weight of the world had finally landed on her shoulders. And when court adjourned that day, she didn't linger. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't glance at the crowd. She just went home. It was a modest house on the edge of town. White shutters, neat lawn, quiet. The kind of place that promised peace, but tonight it offered none. She dropped her keys on the hallway table, kicked off her shoes, and moved to the living room. The TV was already on. She had left it running that morning. The screen was now filled with her own face, paused mid-expression, brows furrowed in frustration from a hearing a year ago. The chyron below read, "A judge under fire. Did she enable corruption?" Whitmore stood still. She didn't sit, didn't flinch, just watched, as legal analysts reviewed her past rulings, compared case outcomes, noted how she'd consistently denied body cam footage, often without explanation. It wasn't that they said she was malicious. They said she was complicit, that she'd looked away too often, too easily. It wasn't the accusations that made her breath catch. It was the quiet implication behind them. You should have known better. She turned off the TV. Silence again. Not the kind you find at night, but the kind that feels like a verdict. She walked slowly toward a bookshelf in the corner. Not for comfort, for memory. On the third shelf, beside an old Bible and a cracked gavel from law school, sat a photo. A younger version of her standing next to her son in uniform. Officer Daniel Whitmore. Kind eyes, gentle smile. He was the reason she had first believed in justice. He had died 3 years ago, shot during a domestic dispute call, and he had died trying to talk someone down, not with a gun in hand, but with his palms open, voice steady. People called him a hero. Tonight, Whitmore wasn't sure she still deserved to be called his mother. She sat down on the edge of the couch, looked at the photo, let the silence settle, and then the tears came. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet and deep. The kind that came from realizing you weren't who you thought you were. That somewhere between ambition and routine, you'd forgotten the very thing that made you human. In that moment, Caroline Whitmore wasn't a judge. She wasn't a public figure. She wasn't the woman people whispered about on TV. She was just a mother, alone in a house that felt heavier than it ever had before. And outside, the world kept turning. People marched. Hashtags surged. Law students wrote open letters. Clergy members held vigils. And legal experts began calling for every single one of her past cases to be reviewed. It was no longer just about Maddox or Becker. It was about a system that had let them operate for years, unchallenged, unquestioned, unafraid. And Whitmore. She knew her silence had helped them. That realization cut deeper than any headline, because in this story there were no more heroes, just people waking up to the harm they'd allowed, and maybe, just maybe, deciding to do something different. You could hear a pin drop. No one in the courtroom moved. Not the jurors, not the bailiff, not even the fly that had been circling the ceiling light all morning. Judge Whitmore sat motionless behind the bench, her hands resting flat on the wood, her face unreadable. Malcolm Hayes stood still, hands clasped in front of him, eyes focused, but calm. No emotion, no anticipation, just presence. Luis Mendez beside him had stopped scribbling notes. He wasn't breathing through his mouth anymore, just clutching his pen like it was the only thing tethering him to the floor. The judge inhaled quietly. And then, this court finds the defendant Malcolm Hayes not guilty on all counts. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. No cheers, no clapping, just release. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a shaky breath. Another person closed their eyes, maybe in relief. The reporters tapped their phones faster than ever before, but Malcolm didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't collapse in relief. He didn't even glance at Mendez. He simply nodded once, as if he'd known this moment would come, not because he believed in luck, but because he believed in the weight of truth when finally allowed to breathe. Across the aisle, Maddox clenched his jaw, his fists curling tightly in his lap. The same man who once paraded Malcolm out of a car in handcuffs now sat frozen, barely blinking. Becker looked worse, deflated, pale. Sweat gathered around his collar. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet realization that things were now very real. Judge Whitmore didn't look at them. Not yet. She reached for a folder beside her, opened it with care, and read from a prepared statement. Based on the evidence presented and the inconsistencies exposed under oath, this court is formally referring Officers Maddox and Becker to the Office of the State Attorney General for a full criminal investigation. That landed like thunder. No one expected her to say it out loud, certainly not on the record. But there it was, clear and steady, delivered without hesitation. For the first time, Maddox's eyes widened. Becker dropped his gaze to the floor. Mendez whispered, "Holy hell," under his breath. But Malcolm still didn't smile. He knew what the crowd outside hoped to hear. He knew Zoe Franklin would break the news within seconds. He knew there would be celebration, marches, commentary. But he also knew this wasn't the end. Not really. This verdict was a door creaking open, not justice served. The system had paused, blinked, but it hadn't changed. Not yet. He turned slowly to Mendez. The young attorney was shaking not from fear but from something else entirely. Like something inside him had cracked and finally spilled out. "I'm not going back to the way I practiced," Mendez whispered. "I can't. I won't." Malcolm looked him in the eye. No lecture, no advice, just a simple, slow nod. That was enough. As court adjourned, Whitmore stood last. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look broken either. She looked aged, like the weight of her robe had suddenly become heavier. She stepped down, slowly, walked past the counsel tables and paused. For the briefest second, she looked at Malcolm. Not in apology, not in defiance, but in recognition. Then she walked away. Outside the courthouse plaza buzzed like a live wire. Protesters, journalists, camera crews, all gathered behind a barricade, now barely holding back emotion. Malcolm stepped out into the afternoon sun, blinking once as the light hit him. He didn't raise his arms, didn't wave. He wasn't there for spectacle. Just then, his phone buzzed. A message from Zoe. "It's live." Front page. "The prosecutor in handcuffs. You need to read it." He didn't open it yet. He stood quietly for a moment, looking out at the sea of people. Some waved signs with his name. Some cried. Others just stood still watching. And somehow in the noise there was clarity. This case wasn't just about Malcolm. It wasn't just about two officers, or even a single courtroom. It was about every time the system tilted just enough to make justice slip through. About every voice that stayed quiet, and every voice that refused to. And today, just for a moment, the truth had stood tall enough to be heard. It was early. The kind of early where the grass still held onto the last of the night's cold, where your breath hung in the air just long enough to remind you you're still here. Malcolm stood at the edge of the cemetery coat collar, pulled high hands in his pockets. He didn't bring flowers. That wasn't their thing. He stopped in front of the old stone one he hadn't visited in far too long. It was modest, worn at the corners, the name barely readable now, Julian Carr. Malcolm reached out and let his hand rest on top of the stone. For a long while he said nothing. Then softly, as if speaking to the wind, he whispered, "You should have been here, Julian." His voice didn't break, but something in his chest did. Julian had been 19, arrested for something he didn't do. The case never made it to trial. He died in pre-trial detention asthma attack untreated. No video, no hashtags, no Zoe Franklin to capture it all. Just silence. Back in his apartment that night, Malcolm sat down in front of a small microphone. No script, no sponsors. Just him. He leaned in. Clicked record. "My name is Malcolm Hayes, Assistant United States Attorney. But today, I'm just someone who made it home when others didn't. We talk about justice like it's a location, a destination. But it's not. It's a fight. A breath. A name that doesn't get forgotten. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be heard." He let the silence sit after that line a full 5 seconds. Then clicked stop. By morning, the 3-minute clip had gone viral. Not because it was dramatic, because it was quiet. And in that quiet, people listened. Zoe called him that afternoon. She sounded tired, wired, both. "You saw the numbers, right? It's everywhere. Cable TikTok. Even your old law school's newsletter." Malcolm chuckled softly. "That's something, huh?" "Yeah. But I need to ask you something," she said. "Do you think justice won?" He paused. "No," he said plainly. "Justice didn't win today. It just survived." There was a silence on the line. Zoe didn't push back. She didn't have to. That answer was the truth, plain and bitter. But that clip, that one line, "Justice didn't win. It just survived," was cut captioned and reposted more than anything Malcolm had ever written in court. One law professor called it the most honest summation of the justice system in a decade. And something happened that no one saw coming. A bipartisan group in the state legislature, under mounting public pressure, introduced the Hayes Bill, a proposal requiring transparency logs for every arrest made in the state. Bodycam footage released within 48 hours. Radio logs archived and made accessible. No more silent rooms. No more lost tapes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it had Malcolm's name on it. Not because he asked for it, but because people finally understood why it mattered. 1 month later, Zoe stood behind the camera as Malcolm gave a short talk at a small community center. He didn't wear a suit, didn't read from a teleprompter. He just looked out over the quiet crowd and said, "This wasn't about me. It was about every name that never made the paper, every voice that was silenced before it had the chance to speak, every Julian Carr this system forgot." He stepped back. No applause. Just reflection. And in the final seconds of the video, as the screen faded to black, a single line appeared in clean white text. "Some get justice. Others never get the chance." Now you know. Closing message from Mr. Mac's Stories. If this story moved you, you're not alone. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about truth being silenced, then fighting to be heard. It was about justice not as a trophy, but as a long, uneven road. And most of all, it was about the voices that never got their day in court, but still echo in the hearts of those who listen. Here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We uncover what others try to bury. We speak for those who were never given a mic. And every time you watch, share, or subscribe, you help keep that mission alive. So if this story meant something to you, please, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And hit that subscribe button to follow us for more powerful human stories like this. Your support isn't just a number. It fuels a small team working late nights to bring you voices that matter. Every click, every comment, it reminds us why we do this. And remember, Mr. Mac's Stories isn't just a channel. It's where truth gets a second chance to speak. Thank you for being part of this.